Good evening. Very warm welcome to Paul Keating, and I think you're in for a treat this evening. Paul Keating requires little introduction. As Prime Minister from 1991 to March 1996, he'll be remembered for many things. But primarily, his legacy is that of one of Australia's foremost big thinkers and Imagineers. He arguably was the first to fully understand and comprehend Australia's place in the Asia-Pacific region and the opportunities that afforded this country if we had a constructive engagement with our part of the world. He also understood that soft power opportunities allowed Australia to be the honest broker for APEC, bringing together the US, China, India, Indonesia, Japan, and many others into one forum. He also had the foresight to campaign and support the creation of an Australian Republic and pragmatic Aboriginal reconciliation. Although not the subject of this evening's talk, it could also be argued, and he doesn't need me to do this for him, that Paul Keating did the groundwork for today's relative prosperity through opening up and reforming the Australian economy. Now, I'm eating into Paul Keating's time. We have exactly an hour. At the end of his speech, we'll be able to take some questions. There won't be too many, so if you'd like to put your hand up at the end of it, we'll try and deal with some of those. And again, if you could keep your questions short and to the point. Now I stop, and I'd like to say once more, if you could give a very warm welcome again to somebody who I know holds all of you and all Victorians in very great affection. Please, another hand for Paul Keating. Thanks a lot.
Well, I wouldn't draw a crowd like this in Sydney, I can tell you that. But then, of course, we don't have the age in Sydney. So maybe that's the reason. But I do appreciate the fact you've come out on this very cold night. We've had probably the coldest winter I can remember. And I appreciate the sponsorship of the series, of the festival by the Age. This is a sensible and good thing for a newspaper to do. And this organic relationship between a newspaper and its community obviously makes for a better newspaper and a better community. So thank you for coming. I wanted to begin by mentioning the fact I turned up not so long ago, produced by one of the major American think tanks, which said that 66% of humanity lives in high-income or high-growth countries, up from 25% 30 years ago. Now, this is a phenomenal statistic. You think about the long history of the world, but in just 30 years, we've gone from a quarter of humanity living in a high-growth, high-income area to two-thirds of it. And that's because since 1982, the world has experienced a 25-year long wave of economic growth, overlaid by only two cyclical investment cycles. That's investment recessions. That was 1989-90 and 2000 to 2003. Not so much here, but certainly in the United States and in the Northern Hemisphere. This extended period of high growth and low inflation has brought prosperity on an unprecedented scale. Growth has risen the world over in a long linear trajectory. This period of macroeconomic consensus and stability has been called the Great Moderation. A moderation in all the factors that go to the production of goods and services and their overall management in conducive monetary and fiscal frameworks. And coinciding with this long period of growth and stability was the strategic epiphany at the end of the 1980s, the end of the Cold War, the bipolar rivalry that characterised and threatened the peace of the world in the second half of the 20th century. A bipolarity that nonetheless evaporated in an instant. What replaced it was the unipolar moment of the West, with the American eagle perched victorious on its mountain lair. That victory, and by not a little coincidence, also came with the full onset of globalisation, the opening of borders to goods and flows of funds, with its concomitant intensification of trade and financial interdependence. As it turned out, a globalisation of economic growth annealed by a globalisation of peace, the first of a kind since that which followed the Napoleonic Wars. The key question now, and the central one of this address is, can that 2/3 of humanity in those high-income and high-growth countries assimilate that growth and prosperity, or will the condition itself corrode or hollow humanity out, slaking us of those earnest values and high convictions that have stood by us down through time? Perhaps more than that, will the seduction of secularity and self-absorption lure us into a bubble of spiritless contentment, sustained only by the inability of others to organise themselves effectively to disrupt or appropriate it? Is it a case, as Pope Benedict recently remarked, that the Western world is a world weary of its own culture, a world, and I quote him, weary of greed, exploitation and division, of the tedium of false idols and the pain of false promises? That is, of course, a world without a guiding light, one without absolute truths by which to navigate. John Stuart Mill made the same point, seeing the great struggle of life as being between creativity and what he called the despotism of custom, or perhaps we could say between originality and tradition, of authenticity, trying to breach those tedious moulds of contemporary culture, replete with their false idols and chimera's of an idealised happiness. Benedict told us recently in Sydney, and I quote him again, that life is a search for the true, the good and the beautiful. And we know that whenever those objectives become subordinated, we become lost in a morass of preferences and experiences uninformed by truth or by ethics. Experiences, he went on to say, which detached from what is good or true, and I quote him again, lead to moral and intellectual confusion and ultimately to despair. So are we capable, those of us in that opportune 2/3 of humanity, of forging a second enlightenment? One not solely dependent on science, but one leavened by understanding and virtue, but making the most of science. One which goes to the profound and the innate dignity of every human life, transcending those old barriers of ethnicity and creed, and of course geography. In a world as we live in today, shrunk by transport and communications, vulnerable to shifts in climate and natural disasters, and subject of devastating weapons and armories, can a higher framework of coexistence obtain, other than one governed by self-interest or nationalism, or indeed by a misplaced sense of superiority? Benedict also said in Sydney that the state cannot be the source of truth and morality, that source can only be a set of truths and values which devolve to what it means to be human, each to one another, society to society, state to state. Of course, in his terms, he meant one of God's creatures. We're currently living through one of those rare yet transforming events in history, a shift in the power of the world from west to east. For 500 years, Europe dominated the world. Now, for all of its wealth and population, it is drifting into relative decline. Will our understanding of this transformation and our acceptance of its equity for the greater reaches of mankind lead us to a position of general preparedness of its inevitability, or will we cavil at it in much the same way as Europe resisted the rise of Bismarck's creation at the end of the 19th century? We can see this with the 29th Olympiad, the questioning of China and the resentment at its pretensions about being one of us, even becoming one of us. The Western liberal press featured, generally in critical terms, the world-long torch relay juxtaposing all that it represents and is good about it with what it sees as China's democratic defects, viewing it almost exclusively through the prism of Tibet, saying, almost, that the aspirations of this massive nation, a quarter of humanity, a legatee of a century of misery, dragging itself from poverty, is somehow of questionable legitimacy because its current government's attitude to political freedoms, and in specific instances human rights, are not up to scratch. Ignoring the massive leaps in progress of income growth, of shelter, of the alleviation of poverty, of dwindling infant mortality, of education, of, by any measure, the much better life now being experienced by the very great majority of Chinese. In a Western and elitist way, we have viewed China's right to its Olympic Games, to its coming out, or its moment of glory, with condescension and concessional tolerance. The Western critic, perhaps feeling the epicentre of the world changing but not at all liking it, seeks to put down those vast societies on the basis that their political and value systems do not match up to theirs, or do not match up to ours. Henry Kissinger made the point recently when he said, and I quote him, "We cannot do in China in the 21st century what others thought to do in the 19th, prescribe their institutions for them and seek to organise Asia." And he went on to pose the question, do we split the world into a union of democracies and non-democracies, or must there be another approach key to regional and historic circumstances? So from that, a question can be asked. How workable would the world be if it was divided into democracies and non-democracies along a line of demarcation set up by self-approving Jeffersonian-style liberals? There is a view that should China become a democracy, that is, a real one, many tensions in the global system would go, that democracies find peace with other democracies, that the former political military state first becomes or turns itself into a trading state, and as wealth and opportunity rise, so do democratic values. But what we must remember is that even if all the states of the world became democratic, the structure of the international system would remain anarchic. India and Pakistan are democracies, but this fact has not lowered tensions between them. Democratic Germany took on the rest of democratic Europe in 1914. Well, some would say yes, but Wilhelmine Germany was not a pristine democracy. But can we divine our way to peace in the international system by a beauty contest as to whose democratic fabric is finest or better than another? The propagation of democracy is a fraught business. But with the end of the Cold War, the liberal interventionists got right into their stride, and of course Iraq was one of the outcomes. R.H. Tawney, a British historian and sociologist, once remarked that war is either a crusade or it's a crime. Well, woe betide the rest of us if the crusaders enjoy an open writ to underwrite military adventurism in the name of democracy in states which have not even developed, organic domestic political structures to take it, much less to grow it. Perhaps we should also consider John Stuart Mill's preference for progress before liberty, or liberty at least in tandem with progress. The fact is, for the first time in any of our lives, indeed for the first time in human history, we now live in a global system. Aviation and telecommunications have underwritten a connectedness with past generations, which past generations could only have dreamt of. Television news and the digital age mark the events of day-to-day life in real time. Everything occurs now in real time. No longer do we concentrate our affairs in our parts of the world, rather we calibrate all we do against the rest of the world as a whole. Our mindset is now global. It is not regional and it's not national. From here on, we have to synchronise whatever we do within an overarching global strategy. A strategy which has to have as its basis the progress of human existence and not simply the propagation of democracy. And it is not as if we've been denied a new canvas to paint out a better picture. For the first time since the First World War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union opened the potential for a new era of peace and cooperation. Russia, humiliated but intact, let the bits fall away from its former union of Soviet states, and wise people like George Herbert Bush, Helmut Kohl, Brent Scowcroft and James Baker saw to it that the bits came away other than in an outburst of triumphalism, that the bits were strategically parked in the quietest and least celebratory way to underwrite an orderly transition from Gorbachev to Yeltsin, and an orderly transition to the independent functioning of those Warsaw Treaty states outside Russia itself. Gorbachev even agreed to reunite Germany within NATO after 26 million of his countrymen and women died releasing the grip of Nazism on their homeland. 26 million. George Herbert Bush talked about a new world order, but then lost to Bill Clinton. And what happened then? Well, nothing happened then. The Americans cried victory and walked off the field. The greatest challenge we faced, whether for managing incidents or easing the new economic tectonic plates into place, will be to construct a truly representative structure of world governance, which reflects global realities, but which is also equitable and fair. For 2 Clinton presidential terms and 2 George W. Bush terms, the world has been left without such a structure. Certainly unable to accommodate Russia and the great states like China and India. Instead, President Clinton and President George W. Bush left us with the template of 1947, the template cut by the victorious powers of World War II, the one where Germany and Japan were left on the outside and still are 60 years later, and in which China and India are tolerated and palely humoured. 16 critical years have already been lost, and it is not as if we are dealing with a world where things are the same now as they were 16 years ago. The world is dynamic. It keeps on changing. 16 years ago, China was not a world power. Today it is. 16 years ago, Russia was collapsing. Today it is growing and growing strongly. The fact is, we are now sitting through, indeed witnessing, the eclipse of American power. Yet for those 16 critical years, 2 American presidents did nothing to better shape the institutions of world governance, to shape it for the day, for that moment in history when the United States becomes simply another power amongst equals or near equals. And there's been no help from the old powers either. Tony Blair's Britain and Jacques Chirac's France. After all, they had box seats to the event, courtesy of being on top in 1947. But Blair's contribution was not anything new or free thinking. Rather, he thought being an American acolyte was all that was required. And Chirac was simply incapable of adding any strategic value to the equation. The fact is, we are now heading towards a bipolar world. Not one shaped by a balance of terror like the old one, but certainly not a multipolar one either. In fact, one heavily influenced by 2 countries, the United States and China. This will face us up to a number of major decisions, and it will face us up to them reasonably soon. For a start, will we regard China as a force for stability and good, a partner in the world, or will we continue to treat China as an upstart economic adversary to be strategically watched? Well, some will say, well, what about Europe? Don't forget Europe. Europe is a pole. Well, I don't think Europe is a pole. Europe, in settlement of its 20th century conflicts, has opted for a form of cooperative regionalism where the prerogatives of each of the former sovereign states have been blended or subsumed to an homogeneous whole, but a whole lacking that most critical of all strategic ingredients, the political ability to conscript and direct the population, to respond militarily and to do it decisively, to do it in its own terms and the terms of its population. In the long history of Europe, with all of its conflicts and wars, this homogenation is actually a welcome change. But the challenge for Europe is to extend that supranationalism to others. States like China and Russia still enjoy a power of galvanic action, politically and strategically of the kind Europe had and used in the 19th and 20th centuries. There may come a time when the young people of these countries refuse to be conscripted for military service by their respective polities. But that time has not yet come, it's not now. As Chinese military power grows in lockstep with its economy, it's reasonable to assume that the only other major strategic force on the landscape will be the United States. That is, just the two of them. But let us not leave out the Russians. Russia's economy, while growing in strength from the burnt-out wreck it was in 1990, will not be in the league of the United States or China. But Russia will still be wealthy enough to continue to field its massive arsenal of nuclear weapons. So whether you attribute to Russia full pole status or not, you can certainly attribute to it huge strategic standing. It is more the pity then that following that unexpected epiphany in 1989, the Clinton administration rashly decided to ring-fence Russia by inviting the former Warsaw Treaty states of Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic to join NATO. By doing so, the United States failed to learn one of the lessons of history, that the victor should be magnanimous with the vanquished. In this case, the victor and its agent, NATO, gave those former Soviet bloc countries an invitation to actually jump camp, and in doing so, strategically occupying the territory that formerly belonged to the Soviet Union, which came within the control of Russia. At some time, the United States will be obliged to treat Russia as a great sovereign power, replete with a range of national interests of the kind other major powers possess. In the meantime, the great risk of this sort of adventurism is that with NATO's border now right up to the western Ukraine, the Russians will take the less costly military option of counterweighing NATO's power by keeping their nuclear arsenal on full operational alert. This posture automatically carries with it the possibility of a Russian nuclear attack by mistake. The years of Russia's economic poverty, certainly since the collapse of its economy in the first half of the 90s, has meant the Russians have allowed their surveillance and early warning systems to ossify. To compensate, they are keeping their nuclear arsenal on full operational alert. That is, there's no need to stand by if you are not in fact standing by. This leaves the rest of the world relying more on generals, battlefield commanders and intelligence assessors to restrain a nuclear response than it does the Russian president or his government. This means that while the Cold War is over, the risk of a mistaken preemptive response has increased. Russia is the only country in the world with the capacity to massively damage the United States to the point of seriously maiming it, and ditto for Western Europe. Wouldn't you think then that when the Russians surrendered their empire in 1990, US policy would have been adept enough to find an intelligent place for them in the overall strategic fabric? That is, to have Russia as part of an enlightened framework of intelligent coexistence, thinking back beyond the Cold War to when we partnered with them to defeat Hitler. But even more than that, in people terms, to invite their 160 million, battered by the 20th century, into the comity and wealth of nations. Instead, the US has conducted itself as unrivaled powers have done throughout time. Unchecked, it exploited its position. It has ring-fenced Russia, treating it as a virtual enemy with its West European and Central European clients egging it on. This week, the United States signed Poland up to build a missile intercept system on Russia's border. Nominally, the system is designed to protect Europe and the Middle East from Iran. Well, that's what Condoleezza Rice has been saying. But even the Poles are now talking about having it to deter Russian aggression. NATO, an organisation rendered moribund by the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been refashioned by the United States as an organisation to extend American power and policy to the security order of Europe. You could be excused for thinking that when the wall came down, the major states of Europe, Germany, France, along with Britain, would have developed their own security order, responding to their own national interests and culture. Certainly with reference to the United States, but not mandated by it. But however likely that might have been, the end result is that the key decisions about European defence and security are made in Washington. Hence Europe's strategic impotence. One of the negative aspects of these developments is that they play into the hands of Russian nationalists while making the hand of those Russians prepared to give liberal democratic principles a go so much weaker. The old West then complains about Vladimir Putin being a poorly disguised Russian autocrat and nationalist when the West has played a major role in creating him. Now, all of this serves to underline the most pressing problem of all, and that is the continuing existence of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapon proliferation is the single most immediate threat hanging over the world today. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, entered by compliant states in 1970, is on the verge of collapse. The treaty represents perhaps the most egregious example of international double-dealing of any international regime. In a nutshell, the nuclear weapon states signed up to the elimination of their nuclear weapons in 1970, while in the meantime other signatory states undertook to forego their development. But now, most of the nuclear weapon states are developing new nuclear weapons. Not only have they not rid themselves of the old ones, they're actually making new ones. Tony Blair announced the new Trident submarine program in 2006, while the Bush administration has turned its hand to new bunker-busting nuclear weapons designed to attack underground facilities. The Russians, of course, quick on the uptake, are doing the same, refining their own arsenal. The old nukes at least have the dubious advantage of existing solely for self-defence. But this new variety of US weapons is actually being designed for use, for intended wartime deployment and operation, and ditto for the Russians. So what sort of future compliance can we expect from states already signatories to the NPT, let alone non-signatories, when the promoters of the treaty reserve the right to ignore their obligations as to elimination while designing and building new devices? In the strategic quiet after the thunderclap that ended the Cold War, as Prime Minister of Australia, a non-weapons NPT signatory, I established the Canberra Commission for the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons in 1995, the first Western government to do so. I did it taking the opportunity of the strategic vacuum to move weapon states down the path of lengthening the fuse or the time on their warheads while proposing to completely dismantle and destroy no longer operationally deployed weapons. That is, not simply to set them aside in pieces, but to destroy them. Robert O'Neill, the Australian Professor of War and Strategic Policy, who was on that commission, recently wrote of his experience in approaching the 5 weapon states upon the report's publication. He said, of the 5, only the Chinese seem, I quote him, seem willing to talk seriously about the changes recommended by the Commission.